The Intellectual Killer, a psychological horror story. John was a man of inconspicuous normalcy. He lived in a modest, well-kept home on a quiet suburban street. His days were filled with the mundane rhythms of a typical life, a steady job, friendly chats with neighbors over fences, and leisurely walks in the park. To the casual observer, John was the epitome of reliability, a pillar of his community. Yet, beneath this veneer of ordinary existence, a darkness lurked, a secret so profound, so unsettling, that it would forever alter the lives of those who stumbled upon it. John was no ordinary man. He was a mind, a labyrinth of intellect that dwarfed most others. His understanding of human psychology was uncanny. He could dissect the thoughts and feelings of those around him with surgical precision. He knew how to manipulate, how to deceive, how to inspire trust where there should be none. But this razor-sharp mind was a weapon, honed for nefarious purposes. John was a killer. He picked people who were alone or sad. These people were easy for him to control. John talked to them, found out what made them afraid, and then he used those fears against them. He enjoyed watching people get scared. It made him feel powerful. John was a master of deception. He'd been living a double life for years, his true nature hidden beneath a carefully curated facade of normalcy. His neighbors knew him as the quiet, unassuming man who lived down the street. They had no idea that beneath his gentle demeanor lurked a cold, calculating killer. He was meticulous in his crimes, leaving no trace behind. Each victim was chosen with care, their disappearance never raising suspicion. John had studied the psychology of fear, knowing exactly how to manipulate his victims before striking. He believed his intelligence and cunning were his greatest assets, a shield against detection. But as the days turned into weeks, a sense of unease began to creep into John's mind. A nagging doubt, a tiny crack in his carefully constructed facade. He'd always been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to evade capture. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so certain. Sarah, a seasoned detective with a reputation for her relentless pursuit of truth, was deep into a particularly unsettling case. A string of unexplained deaths had gripped the city, each victim seemingly isolated, melancholy, and haunted by an unseen terror. The common thread was as elusive as the killer. Sarah had spent countless hours poring over the case files, her mind racing as she tried to connect the dots. The victims, all solitary figures, had exhibited a peculiar despondency in the days leading up to their demise. Their faces, as captured in the few security footage clips, bore a chilling resemblance to those of people trapped in a nightmarish dream. As Sarah delved deeper into the investigation, a sense of unease began to creep into her bones. The more she learned about the victims, the more convinced she became that there was something sinister at work, something far beyond the realm of ordinary human malice. A chilling suspicion took root in her mind. Perhaps these were not merely isolated incidents, but rather the chilling manifestations of a malevolent force, a predator lurking in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable. As she delved deeper into the case, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Each victim had vanished under similar circumstances. Their bodies later discovered in a state of advanced decomposition. The locals whispered of a malevolent force lurking in the woods, a creature of darkness that preyed upon the unsuspecting. Sarah dismissed these tales as superstition. But the eerie coincidence of the victims' fates couldn't be ignored. Day after day, she persisted, her resolve unwavering. She spoke with the grieving families, their eyes filled with sorrow and fear. She listened intently to their stories, searching for any clues, any inconsistencies that might lead her closer to the truth. In her mind, she pieced together a puzzle, each new detail fitting into the larger picture. John, the unseen killer, watched her progress with a mixture of dread and fascination. He had believed himself untouchable, a ghost that could slip through the cracks of society unnoticed. But now, he sensed a growing threat, a determined woman who was closing in on him. He knew he had to act, to silence her before she could expose his dark secret. John started to feel something was wrong. He noticed some people asking questions about the deaths. He saw the police looking into things more closely. John knew he had to be careful. Sarah was closing in on John. She'd spent weeks combing through old records, tracking down witnesses, and even infiltrating the local underworld. Each day, she felt a pang of excitement mixed with dread as she got closer to the truth. John was a master of deception, a man who lived in the shadows. He'd been careful to leave no trace, no digital footprint, no physical evidence that linked him to his crimes. He'd even managed to manipulate the local police department, making them believe he was a victim rather than a perpetrator. But Sarah was relentless. She'd uncovered a pattern in John's disappearances, a connection to a remote cabin in the woods that was rumored to be haunted. With the help of a local historian, she'd learned that the cabin had a dark past, a history of disappearances and strange occurrences. John started to change his routine. He stopped going to the same places. He acted like everything was normal, but inside, he was watching every move. He deleted all the things that could show he was the killer. He talked to people, making sure they thought he was just a nice, regular guy. Every time Sarah got close to finding something, John would change the story. He would blame someone else, or make things look like an accident. It was like a game for him, and he was good at playing it. But even though John was smart, he started to worry. Sarah was getting closer, and it was harder to keep his secret safe. Sarah's mind raced, the certainty hardening into a cold, determined resolve. She wasn't going to be a victim. No more. The deaths, the disappearances, they weren't accidents, they were deliberate acts of malice. Someone was out there, a predator lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next meal. She needed to act. But how? She was just a young woman alone in a seemingly peaceful town. How could she possibly catch a killer? Yet, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. She would find a way. Sarah spent the next few days meticulously planning her trap. She studied the crime scenes, the victims' habits, and the patterns that connected them. She learned the town's layout, its hidden shortcuts, and its blind spots. With each new detail, her plan grew more intricate, more deadly. She began by creating a false sense of vulnerability. She left her front door slightly ajar, a single light on, and a half-eaten meal on the table. It was a bait, a tempting morsel for a hungry predator. She also planted clues, subtle hints that suggested she was onto something, that she was close to uncovering the truth. So, Sarah decided to set a trap. She told her boss that she needed help. They made a plan. Sarah would act like she had no idea who the killer was. She would stop asking questions for a while to make the killer feel safe. They wanted the killer to think the danger was over. But behind the scenes, Sarah was still working. She and her team watched the people who were close to the victims. They followed the clues, hoping the killer would make a mistake. John thought he was safe. He saw that Sarah wasn't asking as many questions, so he relaxed. He thought the danger was over, just like Sarah planned. But Sarah was getting closer. The trap was closing in, and John didn't know it yet. John started to feel that something wasn't right again. He noticed small things. Maybe Sarah wasn't really done with her questions. Maybe the police were still watching. He wasn't sure, but his gut told him that the danger wasn't over. John's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. The clock ticked ominously, each second a nail driven deeper into his suspense. He knew he couldn't afford to wait. The longer he delayed, the more time Sarah had to piece together the puzzle of his identity. He needed to strike quickly, decisively, and above all, he needed to maintain the illusion of innocence. His mind raced, a whirlwind of possibilities and counter-possibilities. He needed to distract Sarah, to lead her down a false trail. But how? He couldn't simply accuse someone else. Sarah was too smart to fall for such a transparent ploy. He needed something more subtle. Something that would sow seeds of doubt without outright accusation. He made false clues, leading the police to think the killer was someone else. He lied to people around him, making them believe he was innocent. John thought he could stay one step ahead of Sarah, like he always did. But this time, it wasn't so easy. Sarah was still following the right trail, and every time John tried to hide, she got closer. The walls were closing in on John, and no matter how smart he was, things were getting harder for him. Just when John thought he could still control the game, something unexpected happened. A new person came into the picture. His name was Mark. Mark was the brother of one of John's victims. Mark watched John from the corner of his eye. He'd been studying John for weeks now, ever since the new kid had arrived. His eerie silence and uncanny ability to blend into the shadows. Unlike the others, who seemed to be under John's spell, Mark felt a growing unease. There was something off about John. His eyes, for one, held a chilling depth that seemed to peer into one's soul, and his laughter, when he did laugh, was forced, almost mechanical. Mark had noticed the way John seemed to avoid direct eye contact, always glancing away at the slightest provocation. John's stories, too, were filled with inconsistencies and contradictions. He spoke of strange occurrences, of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers that followed him in the night, but Mark could sense the underlying falsehoods, the carefully crafted tales designed to sow fear and confusion. Mark started working with Sarah, sharing what he knew. Together, they began to put the pieces together. Mark's help made things harder for John. Now, there were two people getting close to the truth. John didn't expect this. Mark was ruining his plans. He wasn't sure what to do now. The rules of the game had changed, and John was losing control. John knew he couldn't hide anymore. Sarah and Mark were too close now. They had figured out most of his secrets. There was no way out, so John decided to face them. One night, John followed Sarah to a quiet place. It was dark and empty. He wanted to talk to her, to try and control the situation one last time, but Sarah wasn't afraid. She had been waiting for this moment. Mark was hiding nearby, ready to help Sarah if things went wrong. John started talking, trying to confuse her with his smart words. But Sarah stayed strong. She knew what John had done, and she wasn't going to let him get away. John's composed facade began to crumble, his usually serene expression replaced by a flicker of fear. The realization dawned on him with a chilling clarity. For the first time in his life, his carefully constructed illusions were unraveling. His mind games, his manipulation had always been his tools of control, his weapons against the world, but now they were useless. Sarah and Mark, the pawns he'd so skillfully manipulated, were no longer under his sway. The strings he had so carefully woven were snapping, one by one. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he frantically scanned the room, searching for an escape route. The familiar, comforting confines of his home now felt claustrophobic. A prison, he was trapped inside. He could feel the panic rising within him. A tide of terror threatening to overwhelm him. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to decide, fight or flight. But as he weighed his options, a chilling realization struck him. In this terrifying game of cat and mouse, he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. John's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. The cold, metallic walls of the abandoned warehouse seemed to close in around him. He could hear the muffled voices of Sarah and Mark, their urgency growing with each passing moment. He was trapped. His eyes darted around the dim, cluttered space. There were no windows, no exits, only a maze of crates and machinery. He'd been foolish to think he could outsmart them. Now, the consequences of his actions loomed over him. But John wasn't one to give up easily. A flicker of defiance ignited within him. He knew he had to act fast before they caught up. He scanned the room, searching for any potential weapon, any way to escape. John reached into his coat, pulling out a hidden knife. He lunged at Sarah, thinking he could get rid of her and escape. But before he could reach her, Mark jumped in the way. The knife hit Mark instead of Sarah. Mark fell to the ground, badly hurt. Sarah was shocked but didn't back down. She rushed at John and knocked the knife from his hand. She had to choose, help Mark or stop John. Sarah decided to help Mark, calling for backup and trying to stop his bleeding. John used this moment to escape into the night. He was gone, but he left behind something important. His power over them was broken. John was gone, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah helped Mark as the ambulance arrived. Mark was still alive, but hurt badly. As Sarah watched him being taken away, she felt a mix of emotions. They had come so close to catching John, but now he was free again. Somewhere out there, John was still hiding, still planning. Sarah knew he would not stop. He was too smart, too dangerous, but now he knew that people were after him. Sarah stood alone, thinking about what would happen next. Would John come back? Would he change his ways, or would he find new victims? She didn't know. All she knew was that the game wasn't over. The city was quiet that night, but Sarah could feel it. The fear wasn't gone. The killer was still out there.